I was 72 years old when I first said these words out loud. They left me a fortune, but the secret is crushing my life. Saying it still makes my throat tighten. I was raised in a small working-class family where no one believed in quick wealth or easy blessings. Money was always counted in coins first, bills later. I married young, raised 2 children, lost my husband early, and kept working as a school librarian for decades. My life was predictable, simple, sometimes lonely, but never extravagant. That is why what happened 3 years ago still feels unreal, as if I have been living in someone else's story. It began with a phone call on a gray October morning. I was tending to my little garden behind the porch, trying to revive the last marigolds before winter, when the phone rang inside the house. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer from a city I had not visited in decades. He asked for me by my maiden name, which startled me. My married name had been on every bill and letter since I was 20. The lawyer sounded formal yet oddly gentle. He said, "Mrs. Carter, I am calling about the estate of Mr. and Mrs. Franklin." The Franklins were distant relatives I had met only twice in my life, once at a funeral and once when I was a child. They had no children and had lived in another state for as long as I could remember. I had sent them a few holiday cards over the years, but never received much in return except polite thank you notes. When the lawyer said they had passed away within 6 months of each other and had named me as the main heir to their estate, I thought he had the wrong person. I even laughed nervously and told him I had nothing to do with any estate. He asked if I could come to the city the following week to go over the documents. I said yes because his voice sounded sincere and because I was curious. I did not tell my children about the call at first. Both of them had busy lives of their own. My son lived 3 states away with his family and rarely called except on birthdays. My daughter, who lived nearby, was in the middle of a difficult divorce. I felt it was not the right time to distract them with something that could turn out to be a misunderstanding. The trip to the city was uneventful until I stepped into the lawyer's office. There were thick folders on his desk and a sealed envelope with my name written in careful cursive. He explained that the Franklins had owned several rental properties, stocks, a few valuable paintings, and an old farmhouse. The total worth of everything shocked me. A little over $4 million. My knees felt weak. I had never held more than a few thousand in my savings account. The lawyer handed me the envelope. "They left you a letter," he said. My hands trembled as I opened it. The handwriting was delicate but firm. They thanked me for a kindness I had almost forgotten, something I had done as a teenager when I visited them with my parents. Their dog had been sick back then, and I had sat up all night nursing the animal while they were away at a hospital. They wrote that they had always remembered that night, and that my quiet care had shown them the meaning of family. They said they had no one else they trusted with what they had built over a lifetime. I felt humbled and unsettled. I signed the papers almost in a daze, collected the copies, and returned home carrying the secret that would soon start to weigh me down. At first, I thought the hardest part would be figuring out how to manage the inheritance. I had never dealt with lawyers, accountants, or property managers. Yet the real burden turned out to be something else entirely. The letter had included a final request. They wanted me to keep the source of the inheritance private for as long as possible. They had distant relatives who might contest the will, and they feared their assets would be fought over or wasted. They trusted me to protect their legacy until everything was legally secure. I promised myself I would honor their wish. I told my children only that I had inherited some money from old friends. I did not mention the size of it or the conditions attached. I thought secrecy would keep life peaceful, but it did the opposite. My children noticed small changes. I replaced my worn-out refrigerator and had my roof fixed. My daughter asked where the money came from. I brushed off her questions, saying I had used my savings. I could see she did not believe me. Soon the calls from the lawyer became more frequent as paperwork moved forward. I traveled back and forth to the city several times, each trip adding to my children's suspicions. When I returned home late one evening, my daughter was waiting on the porch with her arms crossed. She asked again about the trips, her voice tense. I told her nothing, thinking I was protecting her from trouble. She walked away angry, saying I no longer trusted her. The following month brought more pressure. A distant cousin I had not spoken to in years called me out of the blue. She hinted that she had heard something about the Franklins' will. I denied knowing anything. That night I barely slept. I began to feel as if everyone around me was watching, waiting for me to slip and reveal the truth. My health started to suffer. I developed headaches and found it hard to eat. I kept rereading the Franklins' letter, reminding myself why I was keeping the secret, but each day it grew heavier. What made it worse was my own confusion about what to do with the wealth. I still lived in my small house, drove my old car, wore the same clothes. I did not crave luxury. I wanted to use the money wisely, perhaps donate part of it, help my grandchildren's education, repair the farmhouse the Franklins had loved. But I was paralyzed by fear of making a wrong move that would draw attention or dishonor their memory. I often sat alone at night on the porch, looking at the stars and speaking quietly to my late husband. I asked him what he would have done. I missed his steady hand in decisions like these. I remembered how we used to budget every penny, how we once saved for months to buy a second-hand washing machine. Now I had millions sitting in accounts I was afraid to touch. When the winter holidays arrived, my son's family visited. They noticed the new appliances and the small renovations I had done in the kitchen. Over dinner, my son asked if I had won the lottery. Everyone laughed, but I felt the heat rising in my face. My daughter gave me a sharp look that said she was not amused. After they left, I sat by the window staring at the snow and realized the fortune was not bringing the joy I had imagined. The more I tried to keep the secret, the more distant I felt from the people I loved most. That distance became the true weight on my heart. By January, the strain of keeping everything inside had started to show. I was losing weight, barely sleeping, and avoiding phone calls. My daughter finally stopped by one Sunday afternoon. She brought me soup and bread, and for the first time in weeks, we sat together at the kitchen table without arguing. She looked at me across the table and said, "Mom, you are hiding something. I know you think you are protecting us, but you look miserable. Please tell me the truth." I wanted to tell her everything right then. I opened my mouth but closed it again. The promise I had made to the Franklins echoed in my head. I only said, "I will explain soon. I need a little more time." She sighed and left without pressing further, but the sadness in her eyes followed me for days. The next challenge came from the farmhouse that was part of the inheritance. The property was old but charming, with wide porches, a big barn, and fields stretching toward the horizon. I had visited once to inspect it with the lawyer and instantly felt connected to it. The farmhouse had a warmth that reminded me of childhood summers. I thought it would make a peaceful retreat for me, and a place where my grandchildren could play. Yet the farmhouse was also the source of the deepest part of the secret. In a locked drawer of the Franklin study, the lawyer had found another envelope addressed to me. Inside was a brief note and a single photograph of a young woman holding a baby. The note explained that the woman was a distant relative of the Franklins who had disappeared decades ago under troubling circumstances. The Franklins had cared for the child in secret for a few years before the mother returned one night and left again for good. They never told anyone the full story, fearing scandal at the time. They had kept the farmhouse as a place of memories and regret. Reading that letter made my heart ache. It also deepened my sense of responsibility. The Franklins asked me to keep the photograph and letter safe, to avoid sharing the story with outsiders who might misinterpret it. They believed the mother and child had moved on, perhaps changed their names, and that reopening the past could harm people who deserved peace. I hid the envelope in my own home, but I often thought about the faces in the photo. The woman looked young, frightened, but determined. The baby's eyes were wide and innocent. I wondered where they were now, whether they were alive, whether they knew how much they had been loved in silence. I felt as if I was holding a piece of someone else's life that did not belong to me. February brought more tension. I received a formal letter from a distant nephew of the Franklins, claiming he intended to contest the will. My lawyer assured me the documents were airtight, but I dreaded the idea of a public dispute. If it went to court, the story would spill out and the media might dig into the past. That night I sat awake on the farmhouse porch, watching the moonlight on the snow, thinking of how a simple act of kindness I had done decades ago had tied me to these complicated events. I decided to keep the farmhouse as it was for the time being. I had it cleaned and repaired slightly, but refused to sell or rent it out. Every time I walked through its rooms, I felt the presence of the people who had once lived there. There was an old rocking chair by the fireplace that creaked as if greeting me. In the upstairs bedroom, the wallpaper was faded with tiny flowers that looked almost alive in the sunlight. The peace I felt in that house contrasted sharply with the growing unease back home. My daughter's patience was running thin. One evening, she confronted me again, saying she felt I no longer saw her as trustworthy. I tried to assure her it was not about trust, but about promises I had to keep. She asked whether the promise mattered more than our relationship. That question stayed with me long after she left that night. I also noticed my grandchildren sensing the tension. My oldest grandson, Matthew, who was 12, asked why I was sad lately. I smiled and told him I was only tired. He hugged me and whispered that he wished things could go back to how they used to be, when we baked cookies together without anyone arguing. His words cut deeper than any lawyer's letter. By March, the legal process of transferring assets was complete, and I became the official owner of everything the Franklins had left. I thought I would feel relieved, but instead I felt lonelier. The lawyer congratulated me, saying most people would feel lucky to inherit so much. I thanked him politely but did not feel lucky. The secret about the woman and child at the farmhouse weighed heavier as the future became clearer. I was now responsible for the legacy of 2 lives gone, and 2 more who might still be somewhere in the world unaware of the connection. My health continued to decline. I had frequent headaches and sometimes found it hard to breathe at night. My doctor advised me to reduce stress, but I did not know how. I could not simply erase the truth or the promise. I began writing in a journal every evening to release some of the thoughts I could not share aloud. Those pages hold stories I have never shown anyone. One day in early spring, I drove to the farmhouse alone. The fields were green again, and wildflowers grew along the fence. I sat on the porch with a thermos of tea and listened to the birds. For the first time in months, I felt a touch of calm. I spoke aloud to the Franklins, thanking them for trusting me and asking them to forgive me for feeling overwhelmed. A gentle breeze passed through the trees as if answering. While I was sitting there, an elderly neighbor from down the road walked over to greet me. She introduced herself as Clara and said she had known the Franklins well. She seemed glad that someone from the family still cared for the farmhouse. We talked for over an hour. Clara shared stories about how kind the Franklins had been, how they often helped neighbors quietly. I listened with gratitude. She also mentioned that the farmhouse had always felt full of secrets, though she laughed when she said it. I forced a smile, hiding the knot in my stomach. After that meeting, I realized how important it was to preserve the dignity of the Franklins' memory. Their kindness had shaped the lives of many in ways I was only beginning to understand. I decided that one day I would share the truth with my children, but I needed the right moment, a moment when I could explain without anger or suspicion clouding their ears. The chance came unexpectedly. In April, my daughter called to say she was finalizing her divorce and feeling lost. She asked if she and the kids could stay with me for a few weeks. I agreed immediately. Having them in the house again brought both comfort and new tension. The children filled the rooms with laughter, but my daughter still watched me carefully, as if waiting for me to reveal the secret I held. Living together under the same roof made it harder for me to hide my late-night phone calls and letters from the lawyer about the farmhouse's taxes and repairs. One night she overheard part of a call and confronted me again. Her voice was not angry this time, but weary. She said she was tired of the distance between us and needed to know what I was carrying alone. I told her I would explain soon, I promised, and for the first time, I meant it. I knew then that the time was approaching when the secret would have to come out, no matter the consequences. The evening I decided to tell my daughter the truth began quietly. The children had gone to bed after their homework, and the house smelled faintly of the apple pie we had baked together. I made tea for both of us and asked her to sit at the kitchen table. She looked at me with the same patient but worried expression she had worn for months. I told her everything from the first phone call to the letter from the Franklins, the size of the inheritance, and finally the secret about the farmhouse, the woman, and the baby in the photograph. She listened without interrupting, her face shifting from disbelief to shock to quiet understanding. When I finished, she rubbed her temples and said softly, "Mom, you should have told me sooner. I understand why you wanted to keep the promise, but carrying all that alone must have been unbearable." Hearing those words lifted some of the weight off my chest. For the first time in many months, I felt like I could breathe a little easier. I handed her the photograph and letter. She studied them for a long time, then placed them carefully back in the envelope. "You did the right thing honoring their trust," she said. "But now you have to start living again. The Franklins wouldn't have wanted you to be trapped by guilt." That night we stayed up late, talking not only about the inheritance but about life, regrets, and forgiveness. I told her about the loneliness I had felt since her father passed away, about the years of trying to appear strong while struggling inside. She shared her pain about her divorce, the feeling of failing her children, and how isolated she had felt until she came back home. By the time the clock struck midnight, the distance between us had narrowed. The next morning, she suggested that we take the kids to see the farmhouse that weekend. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it might be good for them to know the place that had become such a part of my story. When we arrived at the farmhouse, the children ran through the fields, their laughter filling the open air. My daughter walked with me around the porch and asked about the repairs that still needed to be done. I showed her the barn that needed a new roof, the garden that could use planting, and the upstairs rooms that had been left unused for years. She nodded thoughtfully and said we could fix them together little by little. That day marked a turning point for me. The farmhouse, which had once felt like a burden tied to the secret, began to feel like a place of healing. I decided to keep it not as a monument to the past, but as a living space for family gatherings, holidays, and maybe even a retreat for those in need. In the weeks that followed, my daughter and I began to work as a team. We met with contractors to fix the barn roof and repaint the porch. Matthew and his sister planted flowers in the garden. I saw in their small acts of care the possibility of giving the farmhouse a new life, one that honored the Franklins' kindness while also giving us a new beginning. Still, not everything was easy. The nephew who had threatened to contest the will did file an official challenge. We were called to attend a preliminary hearing at the courthouse. I dreaded the day we would have to face him, imagining that he would try to smear the Franklins' name or accuse me of manipulation. The hearing was tense but brief. The judge reviewed the documents, which were clear and legally sound, and dismissed the challenge. The nephew left the courtroom without speaking to us. I felt relieved, but also sad that greed had brought such bitterness into what could have been a respectful farewell to the deceased. That evening, after the hearing, we returned to the farmhouse instead of going home. Sitting by the fireplace, I told my daughter that the secret I still kept was not about the inheritance anymore, but about the story of the woman and the baby in the photograph. She asked if I had ever thought about trying to find them. I admitted I had, but was unsure whether it was the right thing to do. If they had moved on and built new lives, I did not want to bring back painful memories. We sat in silence for a long while. The crackle of the fire and the wind outside filled the pauses. Then my daughter said gently, "Maybe part of honoring the Franklins is making sure their kindness reached the ones they once cared for. We don't have to search now, but perhaps someday, when you're ready." Her words stayed with me. For the first time, I began to see the possibility that telling the truth to the right people could be an act of healing rather than harm. Spring turned to summer, and the farmhouse transformed. The garden flourished, the barn stood strong again, and the walls were painted in soft colors chosen by the grandchildren. We spent weekends there, cooking together, fixing small things, and sharing stories around the porch. I noticed how the children began to love the place, as if they could feel its history without knowing all of it. One afternoon, Matthew found an old trunk in the attic. Inside were letters, yellowed with age, written by the Franklins to each other during their younger years. There were also recipes, pressed flowers, and small trinkets that told stories of simple joys and quiet struggles. We spent hours reading the letters aloud, laughing at their playful arguments over recipes, and smiling at their notes of encouragement to each other during hard times. Those letters reminded me that the Franklins were once as ordinary as any of us, trying to hold on to kindness in a world that often overlooked it. I felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the chance to be a part of their legacy. Then, in late summer, an unexpected event stirred up the past again. I received a letter from a woman named Grace who claimed to be researching her family roots. She wrote that she believed she might be related to the Franklins and asked if I had any information that could help her. The letter made my hands shake as I read it. Grace's age, based on the few details she provided, suggested she could be around 50, close to the age the baby in the photograph would have been. I did not respond immediately. I showed the letter to my daughter, who urged me to be cautious, but also said this might be the connection I had been wondering about. I spent several nights thinking, torn between the fear of opening old wounds and the hope of finally giving answers to someone who might deserve them. Eventually, I decided to write back. My reply was brief, asking her to share more details about her parents and what she knew of her early life. I mailed it without telling anyone else, feeling as though I had taken the first step onto uncertain ground. Weeks passed before I heard back. Each day that the mailbox stayed empty added to my unease. When the reply finally arrived, I sat on the porch holding the envelope for several minutes before opening it. Inside, Grace wrote that she had been adopted as an infant and had long wondered about her biological family. She included a photocopy of an old photograph of herself as a baby. My breath caught in my throat. The baby's eyes in the photo were the same as those in the picture I had kept hidden all these years. I knew then that the story was not finished, that the secret I had carried was leading me toward something unexpected. I remember the morning I decided to meet Grace in person. I woke before dawn, unable to sleep, and sat at the kitchen table staring at her letter. The air outside was cool and damp, the kind of morning that usually made me want to stay under the covers. But that day I felt something stirring inside me, a mix of fear and determination. I dialed the number she had written at the bottom of her letter. Her voice on the other end was calm, but carried a hint of nervousness. We exchanged polite greetings at first. Then I suggested we meet at a small cafe near the farmhouse the following weekend. She agreed, and we set a time. After hanging up, I sat quietly, listening to the ticking of the wall clock, trying to prepare myself for the conversation ahead. The day of the meeting arrived warm and bright. My daughter insisted on coming with me, offering support. As we drove to the cafe, I felt my hands grow damp against the steering wheel. I kept glancing at the envelope containing the photograph of the young woman and the baby, wondering if I should show it to Grace right away or wait for the right moment. When we walked into the cafe, I recognized Grace instantly. She was sitting near the window, holding a cup of tea with both hands, as if drawing comfort from its warmth. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed to mask an undercurrent of questions. When I introduced myself, she stood up and hugged me lightly, a gesture that felt both new and strangely familiar. We sat down and began talking. Grace explained how she had grown up knowing she was adopted, but had little information about her biological family. She had started her search after her adoptive parents passed away, driven by a need to understand her roots. I listened carefully, my heart heavy with the knowledge I carried. After a while, I told her about the Franklins, about their generosity, and about the farmhouse that had become a part of my life. I avoided mentioning the photograph at first, afraid it would overwhelm her. But Grace surprised me by saying she had always felt a pull toward the countryside, even though she had grown up in the city. She said something about the place I described sounded oddly familiar, as if she had seen it in a dream. That was when I decided to show her the photograph. I pulled the envelope from my bag, slid the picture across the table, and watched her face closely as she picked it up. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, and she held the photo as though it might vanish if she blinked. She whispered, "I've never seen this before, but that's me. I know it." My daughter reached over and placed a comforting hand on her arm. I asked Grace if she wanted to know the little I had learned from the Franklin's letter. She nodded. I told her about the woman who had left the baby at the farmhouse and returned only briefly, about the Franklins caring for the child in secret, and their decision to keep the past hidden to protect her. Tears filled Grace's eyes. She said she had always wondered why she felt a sense of being loved by someone unknown. She never knew who her biological mother was or what her story had been, but she had felt, even as a child, that someone had cared for her before she was adopted. Hearing about the Franklins filled a gap in her heart she hadn't realized was so large. We spent hours in that cafe, talking and piecing together fragments of history. Grace shared stories about her adoptive parents, about her own children and the life she had built. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet yearning to understand her beginnings. When we finally stepped outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground. Grace looked at me and said, "I feel like I've found a missing piece of myself today. Thank you for keeping this photo safe all these years." I hugged her, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't known was still pressing down. A week later, Grace visited the farmhouse with us. She walked through the rooms in silence, touching the worn wooden railings and pausing by the fireplace. She said it felt strangely familiar, though she had no conscious memories of being there. She asked if she could sit on the porch for a while alone, and I agreed. I watched her from the window as she sat quietly, staring at the fields, as if listening for whispers of the past. In the following months, Grace and I stayed in touch, exchanging letters and phone calls. We did not try to rush the relationship but allowed it to grow gently. I felt that in sharing the secret with her, I had honored the Franklins' wish in a way that gave peace to all of us. Meanwhile, life in my own household began to settle into a calmer rhythm. My daughter started working again, slowly rebuilding her independence after the divorce. The grandchildren found joy in weekends at the farmhouse, where they built tree houses and learned to tend the garden. The place that had once symbolized the burden of my secret now became a center of warmth and connection. In the fall, I decided to host a small gathering at the farmhouse to celebrate the harvest season. We invited neighbors, including Clara, the elderly woman who had known the Franklins for decades. Grace came too, bringing a basket of homemade bread. That day the porch was filled with laughter, stories, and the smell of fresh apple cider. It felt as though the farmhouse itself had come alive, embracing the life it had once sheltered in silence. During the gathering, Clara shared a story about the Franklins planting a row of apple trees decades ago, saying they wanted them to bloom for whoever came after them. We all walked to the edge of the property where the old apple trees stood, still bearing fruit. Grace reached up to pick one, smiling through tears. She said she felt as if those trees were greeting her after a long separation. That evening, as the guests departed and the sky turned pink with sunset, I sat alone on the porch once more, thinking of how far things had come. The fortune I had once feared had now brought people together. The secret that had felt like a weight had turned into a bridge, connecting the past to the present. Yet I also knew life would never be without challenges. The money still required careful management, and the memories of the early days of secrecy still haunted me in quiet moments. But I no longer felt alone carrying the burden. Sharing it had lightened my heart in ways I could never have imagined. In November, Grace called to say she had found a lead on her biological mother's family. She had discovered a distant cousin through a genealogy website and planned to reach out. She asked for my blessing before pursuing it. I told her she had every right to seek the answers she deserved, and that I would support her no matter what she found. That winter, as snow blanketed the fields, I realized how much had changed in a single year. The loneliness that had once wrapped around me had given way to new connections, new responsibilities, and a deeper sense of purpose. I still missed my husband dearly, but I often imagined him smiling at the life we had built out of such unexpected turns. Sometimes, late at night, I would reread the original letter from the Franklins. Their words about kindness and trust never failed to move me. I felt grateful for their faith in me and hoped they would be at peace knowing their legacy was being honored with love rather than hidden in silence. The journey had not been easy, but it had taught me something simple and profound. Secrets can weigh heavy when carried alone, but when shared at the right time and with the right people, they can transform into stories that heal and unite. The new year arrived quietly. I celebrated my 73rd birthday at the farmhouse with my daughter, the grandchildren, and Grace. We sat near the fireplace with a simple cake that Matthew had decorated himself. The children sang with bright voices, and I felt my heart swell with a mixture of pride and gratitude. I had spent many years thinking of birthdays as reminders of aging and loss, but that evening I saw them instead as markers of resilience and second chances. After the cake, Grace surprised me with a gift, a framed copy of the photograph of her as a baby, placed beside a picture she had recently taken of herself with her own daughter. She said she wanted me to have it as a reminder of how far life had come. I held the frame carefully, feeling tears prick my eyes. I told her that for so long I had carried the original photograph in secret, never imagining I would one day share it with the person in the picture. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up late by the fire thinking about the fortune I had inherited. Much of it was still untouched, sitting in accounts, waiting for a purpose. I had been so focused on keeping it quiet and preserving the farmhouse that I hadn't considered what to do with the rest. I wondered whether it was time to use part of it to help others, perhaps in ways that honored the Franklins' quiet generosity. In the weeks that followed, I started making a plan. I set up meetings with a financial advisor to discuss creating a scholarship fund for children from the local community who wanted to pursue higher education. I also thought about repairing the small library in town that had fallen into disrepair. My years as a librarian had shown me how much a well-kept library could mean to a struggling student or a lonely child. When I told my daughter about these ideas, she smiled and said she thought it was exactly what I needed to do. Grace agreed, saying the Franklins would have been proud to see their fortune turned into opportunities for others. The thought gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. But even as we made these plans, life brought new challenges. Grace's search for her biological family had taken an unexpected turn. The distant cousin she had contacted replied with caution, saying their family had old stories about a young woman who had disappeared under complicated circumstances many years ago. They were hesitant to share details without knowing more about Grace. Grace confided in me that she was nervous about pursuing the connection. She worried she might uncover painful truths or face rejection from relatives who had buried the past. I told her that no matter what she found, she had already built a life worth being proud of, and that the past, while important, could not erase the love she had known or the family she had chosen. As spring approached, I threw myself into the renovations of the town library. The old brick building had peeling paint, broken shelves, and a roof that leaked every time it rained. I used a portion of the inheritance to hire workers to repair the roof, paint the walls, and replace the shelves. My grandchildren helped organize the donated books while Grace volunteered to read to the children on Saturdays. Seeing the library come back to life filled me with a sense of accomplishment I hadn't expected. It reminded me that the fortune wasn't a curse after all. It was the secrecy that had been crushing me, not the money itself. By sharing it in ways that helped others, I began to feel lighter. In early summer, Grace invited me to meet the cousin she had been corresponding with. We arranged to meet at a small park halfway between our towns. I could see Grace's hands trembling slightly as she waited on a bench beneath a large oak tree. When the cousin arrived, a woman named Eleanor in her 60s, the meeting began with cautious smiles and polite greetings. The conversation started slowly, both women feeling their way through the fragile territory of long-lost family ties. Eleanor admitted that her mother had once spoken of a sister who disappeared in her youth after falling in love with a man her family disapproved of. That sister, Eleanor believed, might have been Grace's biological mother. Hearing this made Grace's eyes well up. She asked quietly if Eleanor knew where her mother was now. Eleanor shook her head sadly and said she had passed away years ago, leaving behind only scattered stories and unanswered questions. She added, however, that her mother had often wondered what had become of her sister's baby. Grace and Eleanor talked for hours that day, exchanging memories and piecing together fragments of family history. I watched them from a distance, feeling both sorrow for the time lost and joy that they had finally found each other. By the time we said goodbye, they had agreed to stay in touch and continue sharing what they could. Back at the farmhouse that evening, Grace told me she felt both relieved and heartbroken. She was grateful to know more about her origins, but mourned the years that had passed without her mother's presence. I held her hand and reminded her that the love she carried forward was proof that her mother's memory lived on in her. As the months passed, our lives found a new rhythm. The scholarship fund I had envisioned began to take shape, and the first applications from local students started arriving. The library renovation was complete, and on opening day, children crowded the reading corner while parents explored the rows of freshly organized books. Standing there among them, I thought of the Franklins and felt they were with me in spirit, witnessing their fortune being used to brighten lives. By autumn, I had grown accustomed to the changes in my own life. The weight of the secret had diminished, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. My daughter often said I looked younger, as though a burden had been lifted from my shoulders. I knew she was right. I had found peace in sharing what I once thought I had to carry alone. Then, one evening in late October, as the leaves turned gold and red, I received a letter from Eleanor. Inside was a small locket that had belonged to her aunt, Grace's mother. Eleanor wrote that she wanted Grace to have it as a keepsake, something to hold on to as a link to her mother's love. I delivered the locket to Grace myself, watching her eyes fill with tears as she opened it. She wore it around her neck immediately, whispering that she felt closer to her mother than ever before. That night, sitting again by the farmhouse fireplace, I thought about the long path that had brought us all here. From the day I received the lawyer's call to this moment when lives were mended and hearts connected. The fortune, once a symbol of confusion and fear, had become a thread weaving together lost family, mended relationships, and hope for the future. Winter returned sooner than expected that year, blanketing the farmhouse in thick snow. I had always loved the hush that came with snowfall, the way it softened the noise of the world. Sitting by the window in the evenings, I found myself reflecting on the years behind me, how they had shaped the woman I had become, and how the fortune had brought both trials and blessings I never anticipated. Grace had grown closer to Eleanor over the months. They spoke on the phone weekly, sometimes laughing over shared quirks they discovered in their family, or sometimes falling silent as they talked about the mother Grace never got to know. Their bond was slow to form but steady, built on patience and a mutual desire to heal old wounds. Watching their relationship grow gave me a sense of peace. It reminded me that family, even when found late in life, still held the power to comfort. The scholarship program had officially launched in January. I hosted a small ceremony at the renovated library for the first group of 5 students who received the awards. Seeing their hopeful faces brought tears to my eyes. I shook each of their hands, telling them that education had the power to change the direction of a life. One young girl, barely 16, whispered that she wanted to study law to help families like hers who struggled with injustice. Her determination reminded me of the fierce resolve I'd felt in my younger years. Not long after that ceremony, Grace received news that shifted our lives again. She had been offered a promotion at work, one that required her to relocate to another state. While it was an exciting opportunity for her career, it meant moving away from the farmhouse and the life we had built together over the past year. She approached me gently about the decision, clearly torn between ambition and the home she had found with us. I assured her that I understood. I told her that the farmhouse would always be her home no matter where life took her, and that she deserved to follow the opportunities that came her way. Though I spoke with calm and encouragement, I felt a pang of sadness at the thought of her leaving. Grace had become more than a friend. She was like another daughter to me. We spent the weeks before her move packing her things, reminiscing over the nights we had shared tea by the fireplace and the mornings we had walked together through the orchard. On her last evening at the farmhouse, she sat with me in the living room, her locket resting against her sweater. She said that meeting her cousin and wearing the locket had given her a sense of belonging she had never known before. She promised to visit often and told me that she wanted to keep helping with the scholarship fund from afar. The morning she left, the sky was pale and quiet. I stood at the gate as she drove away, her hand waving out the window until the car disappeared down the snowy road. I felt both proud of her and a little lonely. The farmhouse, once filled with the sounds of her laughter and the chatter of my grandchildren during their visits, felt emptier than I liked to admit. My daughter noticed the change in me and suggested I consider hiring someone to help around the house, maybe a part-time caretaker. I resisted at first, insisting I was still capable of managing on my own. Yet I had to admit that climbing the stairs had become harder in the colder months, and tending to the garden alone was proving too much. Eventually, I agreed to meet with a woman recommended by the library's director. Her name was Lydia, a widow in her late 50s who had recently moved to town. Lydia was kind and unpretentious, and we soon fell into an easy companionship. She helped with the chores I struggled with and often stayed for tea in the afternoons. We talked about our pasts, our losses, and the small joys we had both rediscovered later in life. Having her around softened the edges of my solitude. Meanwhile, the scholarship fund continued to grow, supported by donations from townspeople who admired what we were doing. It gave me a sense of purpose to attend the board meetings, reviewing applications and hearing stories of students striving to rise above their circumstances. I often thought of the Franklins during those meetings, wishing I could tell them how their fortune was being used to transform lives. One night, as I prepared the house for an upcoming winter storm, I received a phone call that unsettled me. It was from a man named Charles, who introduced himself as a former business partner of the Franklins. He claimed he had information about their estate that I needed to hear. His tone was polite, yet carried an urgency that left me uneasy. I arranged to meet him at a cafe in town the next afternoon. Lydia insisted on accompanying me, sensing my apprehension. When we arrived, Charles greeted us with a stiff smile and sat down with a leather folder in hand. He explained that years ago, the Franklins had invested in a piece of land that was never properly documented in the will. As their closest living beneficiary, I was now the legal heir to that property, a fact that had only come to light after a recent audit. The news caught me off guard. I thought I had already inherited everything and had spent years coming to terms with the responsibility that came with it. The idea of yet another piece of wealth being added to my name felt overwhelming. I asked him about the property's value, and he said it was substantial, enough to rebuild the farmhouse twice over and still have more left. On the way home, I felt the old weight creeping back, the same unease that had plagued me when I first received the inheritance. Lydia noticed my silence and gently reminded me that wealth itself was not a burden. It was how I chose to use it that mattered. Her words stayed with me through the night as I stared at the snow-laden branches outside my window. A few days later, I received documents confirming the transfer of ownership. I felt torn between gratitude and dread. I had no interest in accumulating more possessions or money, yet I realized that this unexpected windfall could further the work I had started with the scholarships and the library. After a sleepless night, I decided to dedicate the land's profits to building a community center in town, a space for tutoring, workshops, and gatherings for families in need. When I announced the plan at the next board meeting, the room erupted with applause and excitement. For the first time since Charles's call, I felt relief. Turning the fortune outward again, toward the community, was the only way I knew to keep it from crushing me. As winter melted into spring, I watched the first steps of the community center's construction with a mixture of pride and humility. I often stood near the site, watching workers lay the foundation, thinking of how the Franklins' legacy continued to ripple outward, touching lives they would never know. Evenings at the farmhouse grew quieter after Grace's departure, yet I found comfort in the rhythm of my days. Lydia's company, the progress of the community projects, and the occasional visits from my grandchildren kept my heart warm. I had learned to live with the fortune, not as a burden to hide, but as a tool to bring meaning to the years I had left. Still, late at night, I sometimes thought about the secret I had carried for so long. I realized it had never been the inheritance itself that weighed me down. It was the silence and the fear of judgment. By speaking of it openly and sharing its benefits, I had freed myself in ways I hadn't thought possible. On the first anniversary of the scholarship fund, the library hosted another ceremony. Among the new recipients was the young girl who had once told me she wanted to study law. She approached me with a radiant smile, saying she had been accepted into a pre-law program. Her words filled me with hope that the seeds we planted were beginning to flourish. Summer came with a gentle warmth that spread across the valley, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. The farmhouse no longer felt haunted by secrets, but alive with the echoes of children's laughter from scholarship events, neighbors stopping by with fresh bread, and the scent of the blooming orchard. I had grown older, yes, but I felt lighter, as if the burden that once shadowed me had dissolved into the sunlight. Grace returned for a visit in June. She had driven for hours to surprise me and stepped out of her car with a wide smile, her daughter skipping behind her. I rushed to greet them at the gate, my heart swelling with happiness at the sight of the two of them. The little girl, who had grown taller since I last saw her, ran into my arms and hugged me tight. Grace said the locket was still her most treasured possession, a daily reminder of the connection she had found. That weekend, we spent hours on the porch sharing stories and tea, watching the children play under the apple trees. Grace told me about her new job and the challenges of adapting to a different city. She admitted that while the move had been good for her career, she often missed the simplicity of the farmhouse and the feeling of belonging she had discovered here. I assured her the door would always remain open to her and her family. During her visit, we attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the community center. The townspeople gathered under a bright summer sky, clapping as the first shovel of soil was turned. Local officials gave short speeches, but what touched me most was hearing one of the scholarship students, now in college, speak about how the library and the fund had changed their life. As I listened, I thought of the Franklins and whispered a silent thank you for their generosity that had outlived them. That evening, after the crowd had gone and the site was quiet again, Grace stayed back with me. She placed her hand over mine and said, "You've turned what once felt like a heavy secret into something beautiful. I think you've given this town hope." Her words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I told her that I hadn't done it alone, that it was her presence and the memories of those who had believed in me that guided each step. A few days later, Grace and her daughter returned home, and once again the farmhouse grew still. Lydia had taken a short trip to visit her sister, so for a few days I was alone. At night, I sat by the window watching fireflies blink over the garden, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short span of time. I wondered if the Franklins had faced similar doubts when they first built their wealth, whether they too had questioned the meaning of what they left behind. It was during one of these quiet evenings that I found an old box in the attic, one I hadn't opened in decades. Inside were letters I had exchanged with my late husband when we were young. I spent hours reading them by lamplight, rediscovering the tender words of a love that had shaped my youth. I realized then that life's real fortune had always been the people we cherish, the bonds we form, not the possessions we accumulate. Money could build a library or a center, but it was love that gave those places a soul. When Lydia returned from her trip, I shared some of the letters with her over tea. She listened patiently as I recounted stories of my husband's humor and kindness, moments I hadn't spoken of in years. She said that perhaps sharing these memories was another way of honoring the past, of keeping the people we loved alive in our hearts. By autumn, the walls of the community center had begun to rise, and the townsfolk often stopped by after work to help paint or carry supplies. It became a shared effort, a project that belonged to everyone. The sense of unity reminded me of the early days of my marriage when neighbors would come together to harvest crops or repair a barn. Watching that spirit return gave me hope that the center would become more than just a building. It would be a symbol of what we could accomplish together. One morning in late September, as I was tending to the roses near the porch, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. Startled, I sat down on the steps until the wave passed. Lydia insisted I visit the doctor, and though I protested at first, I eventually went. The doctor said it was likely stress combined with age, and advised me to rest more, to let others handle the heavy lifting. I smiled and promised to listen, but inside I felt the quiet reminder that time was no longer mine in abundance. That evening, I wrote a letter to my daughter and another to Grace, telling them how proud I was of them and how grateful I felt for the life we had shared. I didn't tell them about the doctor's warning. I simply wanted to leave them words of love in case I never found the right moment to say it again. Writing those letters felt strangely peaceful, as though I was closing chapters that had long been open. Winter approached again, the second since I had begun transforming the fortune into something meaningful. Snow fell early that year, covering the town in a soft white blanket. The library stood like a beacon on Main Street, its windows glowing warmly in the cold. The community center was nearing completion, promising to open its doors by spring. On Christmas Eve, the library hosted a small gathering. Children from the scholarship program performed carols, and parents shared warm cider by the fire. I sat in the front row, Lydia at my side, and listened to the children's voices fill the room. In that moment, I felt the full circle of the journey. From the day I had been handed an unexpected inheritance that once felt like a curse, to this night where the fortune had brought joy to so many. Later that night, as I returned to the farmhouse and stood by the window looking out over the snowy orchard, I realized something. The secret that had once crushed me had never been about the money or even the fear of judgment. It had been about my own reluctance to accept that I was worthy of carrying such a gift. It took time, love, and the trust of those around me to understand that wealth is not meant to be hidden away, but shared. That its true value lies in the lives it touches. As the clock ticked past midnight, I whispered a quiet promise to myself that whatever time I had left, I would spend it living with open hands and an open heart. I would not let silence weigh me down again. I would tell my story to anyone willing to listen, hoping they might see that even burdens can be transformed into blessings if carried with kindness. Now, as I sit here speaking to you, sharing this story in my own voice, I feel the presence of everyone who shaped this journey. My husband, whose letters still rest in the attic. The Franklins, whose generosity lit the path. Grace, who became like a daughter. My own family. and all the children whose futures are brighter because of a fortune that once felt like a chain around my neck. If there is one thing I hope you take from this, it is that the value of what we inherit is not measured in numbers or land deeds, but in the way we use it to make the world better for others. Secrets may weigh us down, but sharing our truths has the power to set us free. That is my story. From being handed a fortune I never asked for to learning that wealth alone cannot bring peace, I have found that love, compassion, and purpose are the only treasures worth keeping close. And though the years ahead are few, I am no longer afraid. I have made peace with my past, honored the memory of those who gave me this gift, and found joy in the giving of it away. I will close with this thought. Never let fear of judgment silence your voice. Speak your truth, share what you have, and remember that even the heaviest burdens can become a blessing when carried with grace.